If suddenly New START goes away and the Russians race ahead, we will not have a predictable environment in which to modernize. We will be chasing them, and we may end up spending a good deal more than the 1 trillion plus that we're looking at now.
That's the voice of Rose Gottemoeller, distinguished lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button for our 71st episode. Tom is taking a much-deserved vacation with his family, so it is up to me to lead you through today's episode, an episode I think you're really going to like. First, on Early Warning, I ask Bunmi Akinnusotu, host of the What in the World podcast, about what Kamala Harris's VP selection means for foreign policy, while Ploughshares Fund's Mary Kaszynski forecasts whether the Trump administration's efforts to snap back sanctions on Iran would be successful. But before Tom left, he sat down with diplomat Rose Gottemoeller. Rose is an incredible force in the nuclear field. She's the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, the chief negotiator of New START, among a long list of accomplishments. She maps out the possibilities and pitfalls of the U.S.-Russia relationship, particularly on nuclear issues, in this decade, and looks at what should come next. Lastly, yours truly answers a question about high explosives and nuclear weapons in our Q&A segment, thanks to a question from Chris in Austria. If you want your question answered on air, remember to tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org. We love hearing from you. And as always, we love hearing from you in the form of subscribes and ratings, so please let us know how we're doing. With that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by first-time guest Bunmi Akinnusotu, creator of the podcast What in the World. She is an advisory member of Diversity and National Security Network and Truman Security Fellow. Bunmi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm also pleased to welcome back Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Policy Director here at Ploughshares Fund.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
So, as you both know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news, because 7 minutes is about the amount of time a U.S. president would have to decide whether or not to launch nuclear weapons in response to an incoming attack. And our time starts now. Bunmi, last week, the big news was that Kamala Harris was named the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic Party ticket. What does she bring to the campaign, particularly on issues related to foreign policy and national security?
Well, first of all, this is an exciting time for anybody who is a Black woman, an Asian woman, a woman. I think it's an exciting time for Americans. I certainly felt just rejuvenated after the announcement, more so than I thought I would be. But so I think to your question about Kamala, this is a rallying point for the Dems. This is a level-setting opportunity for the Dems to just remind not just Americans, but the world about what just happened the last 4 years and what will happen in the future. I don't care if it's the issue of climate change, if it's nukes, whatever. This is the level-setting moment. And what does Kamala bring? She's extremely strategic and smart. If you studied her domestic policies, there's no question that she is very strategic. I know she's gotten some backlash about her domestic policies, particularly around truancy and criminal justice in California. But listen, those issues are not easy. And she's demonstrated she's willing to take bold steps and solve problems which we desperately need in the foreign policy space. Again, similar to domestic issues, they're not easy. They're very complicated, but she has shown that she's willing to make tough decisions. And during the campaign, this is what Kamala brings. She is tough, but she's not so tough that she is unapproachable and irrational. She is the muscle, the intellectual muscle, the policy muscle that the Dems need to convince the American public that she brings valuable experience and can set us back on track wherever that track may lead.
So have you seen anything in particular with her role in the Senate on the Intelligence Committee or in any of her votes related to national security or defense?
Yeah. So first off, she did not vote for the increase to support the Department of Defense. And I think that signals her ability to think holistically about America's approach to foreign policy. So she's mentioned supporting the diplomatic community. She's talked about wanting to, strengthen the domestic issues related to education and certainly healthcare with COVID and all of these elements. The Democrats, I think, have said, look, if we can strengthen our domestic issues, certainly we'll be more prepared for dealing with issues abroad.
Thanks. Mary, last week, the UN Security Council voted down the United States' effort to extend an arms embargo on Iran, which we expected. But now the Trump administration has threatened to try to invoke so-called snapback sanctions that are in the Iran nuclear deal. But the U.S. pulled out of the agreement. So how would this work?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's a really convoluted argument that the Trump administration is making. So basically, in the Iran deal, there was written in there a snapback mechanism that enables any participant to the deal to dissolve the JCPOA, to dissolve the current nuclear deal, and snap back all of the previous UN sanctions on Iran. And they can do that unilaterally because the fear was that Iran might cheat and Russia and China would block with their veto any attempt to snap back sanctions. So within the Iran deal, there's this ability for any participant to the Iran deal to dissolve it and snap back the previous sanctions. The problem is that President Trump explicitly withdrew from the Iran deal. In fact, in the announcement, he actually said that the U.S. is no longer participating in the nuclear deal. So the Trump administration now, because they're so obsessed with canceling the nuclear deal, which was one of President Obama's signature foreign policy achievements, Trump is so obsessed with trying to dissolve the nuclear deal that they're now arguing that the U.S. is technically legally still a participant, even though they explicitly said the U.S. is no longer a participant. So it is a very convoluted argument. The real goal here, though, and I think the important point is that the Trump administration only has a certain amount of time left on the clock, and they know that very well. So they're trying to do as much damage as possible to the international consensus on Iran to potentially block the Biden administration from rejoining the JCPOA, which is something that Vice President Biden and Vice President nominee now, Harris, they've both committed to rejoining the JCPOA in a new administration. So this is the Trump administration's kind of last play. They're trying to prevent that from happening.
So this question goes to both of you then. Is it likely, do you think that they will try, that the Trump administration will try this? And if they do you think that they will succeed?
I think it's really likely that the Trump administration is going to try to invoke the snapback mechanism. They really don't have anything to lose at this point. Their Iran policy has been a disaster from start to finish. So short of an about face where they rejoin the JCPOA and try a completely different Iran policy where they're working with European allies to try to bring Iran back, that seems unlikely, I would say impossible.
Right.
So they're very likely to continue on this same tack of just trying to trying to bash Iran and provoke Iran into taking even more disastrous steps, potentially to peel off one or two of the Europeans who could dissolve the JCPOA themselves if they really wanted to. So I think the Trump administration kind of across the board, but you can particularly see it on Iran, they're just trying to create as much chaos as possible to make it as difficult as possible for the Biden administration to try to fix all of these messes.
Yeah, and I would add that that's a great point, Mary. I would add that it's a great talking point and headline for the administration, but we all know that to do these things, it requires implementation. So it's great to say, yeah, we're back and we're going to force our allies or do these things, but how much can you actually do when the time is ticking?
And the Trump administration has never shown any real willingness to put in hard work and tackle tough problems. And the Iran issue is a real challenge across the board. And the Obama administration put a lot of time and effort into working with allies and working with the Russians and Chinese to try to solve these really tough problems. With the Trump administration, it's more like it's my way or the highway. And if we don't get our way, we're going to try to bully everybody else into going along. And if that fails, we're going to try to create as many problems for our successors as possible.
Right.
Well, speaking of ticking time, our time is up. Bunmi and Mary, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle. This is great. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Bunmi. Thanks, Michelle.
Rose Gottemoeller is a distinguished lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Before joining Stanford, she was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. And prior to NATO, she served for nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary of Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. State Department in the Obama administration. And she was Chief U.S. Negotiator for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as New START, with Russia. Rose, it is so great to have you here. Thanks for coming.
It's really my pleasure.
So, Rose, let's start with New START. As one of its creators, I know you must be concerned that the treaty expires in about 6 months. Without New START, there will be no limits on U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals for the first time in 50 years. Of course, the Trump administration could extend for 5 years, but is instead focusing on bringing China into the process. What do you think the Trump administration is up to here?
I think that they truly do think that China needs to come to the table. And so they are trying to lever China to come to the table. But as a matter of fact, it hasn't worked because the Chinese nuclear numbers are so much lower than those of the US and Russia. Just look at the number of warheads. The US and Russia both have over 4,000 warheads. And China, by various accounts, has between 300 and 500. So US and Russia have about 10 times the number of warheads that China has. So China's basically said, look, this doesn't make any sense for us to come into what is a bilateral arms reduction treaty. You guys keep working and we'll look to the future. I think it is right, though, that the Trump administration has tried to push the Chinese to come to the table and begin to speak about negotiated restraint. They've never been willing to talk about any restraints on their nuclear forces or their missile forces. So I think it is time to begin that conversation, but it's not time to try to force them into a reduction negotiation.
Do you see any realistic chance of bringing China into this process? And do you agree with Trump, the Trump administration, that China is a rising threat?
It's clear that China is modernizing its forces, and it's doing so in a way that raises questions about their longstanding doctrine, which is what is called a secure second strike doctrine. They have not kept their warheads mated to their missiles historically because they said, well, we will ride out an attack. We will allow a nuclear attack to occur on our territory, and then we will be ready to retaliate. We will ensure that our missiles are secure and can retaliate afterwards. Well, now it looks like they're moving to more of a prompt strike approach because they are building systems like submarine-launched ballistic missiles. You really can't send a missile to sea without its warhead already mated on it. And so we are beginning to see them building these big submarine-launched missile systems and thinking, does that mean that they are moving more to, we call it first strike stability, having the ability to hold your adversary at risk of a first strike. If it's an equal risk of first strike between the two, then we say that it is a stable situation. Of course, you can argue with that because nuclear weapons are such dire weapons that can they ever be totally stable? But there is a sense that if you have equality in first strike capability, parity, as we sometimes say, that you have a certain amount of stability in that.
So from your perspective, are you saying that it would be more stable for China to have a first strike stance?
Oh, by no means. I'm just saying that's what we're seeing them heading toward now with some of these new missile systems. And I think, frankly, their longstanding second strike approach, second strike assured retaliation approach, was much more prudent because it was, frankly, cheaper. It didn't require them to be pouring a huge amount of resources into their nuclear forces. They could keep the numbers low, and they could assure the deterrent without having a lot of nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, or missile systems that are devoted to nuclear missions. Now, they have been building up a lot of conventional missiles, and that is an area that I think it deserves looking at to see if we can, in fact, figure out a way to get them to the table to talk about their large deployment of conventional missile systems, very capable and highly accurate systems, ground-launched, intermediate-range systems that would have been, if they'd been part of the treaty, they would have been banned by the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, the Russians started cheating on the INF Treaty, the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, with the deployment of a new missile that is called the 9M729, or NATO calls it the SSC-8. There are always two names for these things, but the Russian name is 9M729. In any event, the Russians started cheating in deploying this missile, and the United States, working together with its allies, with a great deal of regret, withdrew from the treaty at this time last year in 2019. But there is a problem, and Putin himself has pointed to the problem of proliferation of these missiles across Eurasia, in North Korea, in China, in India and Pakistan, in Iran. And so the Russians recognize that if you have a lot of these ground-launched intermediate-range systems, nuclear or conventional, it can be a problem because they fly very quickly to their targets and they pose a threat of what we call prompt strike on command and control nodes. They can get to a command and control center very, very quickly. And so the Chinese are going to have an interest in this problem too. Do they really want to see their own command and control nodes threatened by these missiles deployed either by Russia or by the United States? Because following the demise of the INF Treaty, the U.S. has now started talking about putting such ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, conventionally armed, in Asia. And so I think that could be perhaps an incentive for the Chinese to come to the negotiating table and start to talk about putting some constraints on intermediate-range ground-launched missiles.
What other steps do you see that the United States could take to try to contain the Chinese challenge?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to keep a sharp eye on what they're doing. I don't believe there's any reason to panic right now. We will have what I call strategic warning if suddenly they're starting to race to parity, if they're starting to build a new large number of warheads very, very quickly. We will see that coming. We'll be able to tell what's going on. Likewise, if they begin to pour a lot of money into acquiring new delivery systems, new missiles, new bombers, new submarines, we will see that coming and we will have time to respond. So I don't think there's any reason to panic. I do think that we need to keep a sharp eye on China, But I think now is the time to open up a conversation with them and say, look, you've been responsible in the past. You negotiated the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and joined it, although they haven't yet ratified the treaty, like the United States, who hasn't ratified the treaty. You've also joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You do understand the value of restraint with regard to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. So let's have this other conversation about your own nuclear forces, your strategic nuclear forces, and whether in future you might be willing to enter into some limits and restraints on them.
Getting back to New START, you wrote in a New York Times editorial or op-ed last year that without New START, things could change drastically and quickly. What did you mean by that, and how might that happen?
New START places a limit on the United States and Russia. Each of us have the same limit, 700 delivery vehicles, that is missiles, particularly bombers that can deliver warheads to their target, and 1,550 warheads deployed on those 700 delivery vehicles. So we are both limited by the treaty. The Russians have, however, the ability to upload a significant number of warheads on their missiles. They have very large missiles that have extra spaces on their front ends, so to say. So they could deploy an additional number of warheads on their, for example, their heavy missile, we say deploys 10 warheads, but they could put up to 15 on some of their heavy missiles, and they could increase the warhead numbers on other missiles. Some say by as many as 1,000 warheads they could rapidly upload. So that's the worry I pointed to in my New York Times article back in November. But since that time, I've also focused on the fact that they just finished their modernization process. And so they have a number of modern missiles now deployed. It also means they have hot production lines for manufacturing more missiles. So not only could they outrun us in warhead numbers pretty quickly, but they could outrun us in missile numbers pretty quickly if New START suddenly went away. We are modernizing as well. I support that modernization. I have supported it, twinned with the continuation of arms control, because if you have a modernization that takes place on under a 700 missile limit, that means you are going about it in a judicious way. You are not rushing to raise the numbers. But if New START goes away, the Russians may rush to raise their numbers, and that we need to be concerned about. Honestly, Tom, I think the most significant point is that we want to conduct our nuclear arsenal modernization now. At least some of us do. And as long as New START stays in place, we will have a predictable environment in which to conduct that nuclear modernization and keep the costs down, because we know exactly how many systems we'll be able to deploy. If suddenly New START goes away and the Russians race ahead, we will not have a predictable environment in which to modernize. We will be chasing them, and we may end up spending a good deal more than the 1 trillion plus that we're looking at now.
So on this issue of modernization, I think the question is how much to modernize, right? It's not really a question of yes or no or on or off, but how much is enough? And as you just mentioned, the Trump administration, building on Obama administration plans, is planning to spend more than $1 trillion to rebuild the arsenal over the next 30 years. Interestingly, the draft Democratic policy platform states, and I quote, "We will work to maintain a strong, credible deterrent while reducing our over-reliance and excessive expenditure on nuclear weapons. The Trump administration's proposal to build new nuclear weapons is unnecessary, wasteful, and indefensible," unquote. What do you make of that, and how do you think a Biden administration might seek to reduce the nuclear spending plan?
It's an interesting question because the program of record that emerged from the Obama administration for modernization of the nuclear arsenal did contain funds for both building new delivery vehicles, new submarines, new bombers, we're looking at ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the idea was that was the program of record, and it also had an aspect in it of having the capability to produce warhead pits so that if we needed to replace some pits, we would have the ability to manufacture them. But this was not an expansive program. This was not to expand warhead numbers and build up warheads. This administration seems to have concluded that this is a time where the United States, instead of reducing and eliminating nuclear warheads, needs to have the potential to expand the number of warheads that we have available. I don't agree with that. I think we have still the running room to further reduce warheads, and in fact, that is our commitment and obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to continue to reduce and eliminate warheads. It's a fact that we've come a long way since the 1960s. At the height of the Cold War in 1967, we had 32,000 warheads. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're down to just over 4,000 warheads now. So there's been a significant reduction, but we need to continue along that trajectory, moving downward and reducing and eliminating rather than turning the corner and starting to build up again.
So I imagine you would agree that one of the most important things we can do to keep the arms control and reduction process going is extend New START. Now, if Trump refuses to extend New START, but does not withdraw from it, and Biden wins in November, would there be time for Biden to extend New START before it expires?
We wrote the treaty very simply, with the procedure being a simple exchange of diplomatic notes to extend the treaty. This extension is an inherent part of the treaty. It will not have to go back to the Senate for its advice and consent to ratification. We would have to, of course, inform the Senate of the extension. So I believe that those 15 days would be sufficient time from January 20 to February 5th, when the treaty would otherwise go out of force, to extend the treaty. Of course, for the Biden administration, they'll have to be thinking ahead about what it will take, because there'll be a lot in the president's inbox on his very first day in the Oval Office. And so New START will have to be near the top of that pile. Otherwise, the one thing I'm concerned about is that it may get lost in the very early and many priorities and issues that will be coming at the new president. So I think that goal and objective of getting New START extended will have to be front and center for the new Biden team.
There are indications that that's the case. Support for New START is something that candidate Biden has already spoken about in support of. So let's hope that's high on their agenda.
I'll just mention one other thing about the extension of New START, and that is that the Russians have agreed, Putin himself, President Putin, has agreed to extend New START for 5 years unconditionally. And I frankly see this as a kind of significant victory for the Trump administration, because they put a lot of pressure on the Russians with regard to the extension of New START. And one by one, the Russians dropped the conditions that they had to the extension of the treaty. So they are now saying they are ready to extend the treaty unconditionally, which is a good thing. And they've said that at the highest level. President Putin has said it. The issue now, I think, is that at least some Russian experts are out there saying that there will be a requirement for some kind of legislative process on their side that could take some time. We can't wait till the last minute. We need time to do this with our Duma, with our Federation Council. I hope that should it come to a last-minute extension, that nevertheless the Russians will be ready to proceed. And I do also recognize that often their legislative processes get abbreviated. For example, when they seized Crimea back in 2014, their Duma process to ratify that step only took a couple of days. So I don't see this as an insuperable problem, but I did want to mention it because it's out there, and the Russians, the expert community there is mentioning it from time to time.
Now, of course, the other potential roadblock is that President Trump would seek to withdraw from New START before we get to that point of a new administration. How likely do you see that possibility?
This administration itself said just this past April, when they put out the annual compliance report, that Russia is in full compliance with the New START treaty. So I don't understand what the case would be for the Trump administration prematurely to withdraw from the New START treaty. They themselves have said that Russia is not violating the treaty. It's in full compliance. and therefore saying that somehow Russia at the last minute is in material breach of the treaty. I just don't understand how that case can be made. I think, frankly, there would be a political cost to the administration for doing that during the urgent election season. So I think my advice to them would be it's not a wise direction of travel.
I hope you're right. Let's assume for the moment that a President Biden is the next administration and manages to save the arms control structures by extending New START with Russia. Where do you think the United States and Russia should go from there? What's the next reasonable step in U.S.-Russian reductions?
My view is that we should run the same play that President George W. Bush ran in 2002, again with Putin, still the president during that era, in negotiating what was called the SORT Treaty, the Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty, or the Moscow Treaty. It took place during a time when the START Treaty was still in force, and Putin and Bush at that time simply negotiated another reduction and layered it on top of the START Treaty. So START continued to be implemented, continued in its verification regime, notifications, exchange of data. All of those mechanisms were also then used to implement this new reduction. If New START is extended for 5 years, I think that the two presidents, this time Biden and Putin, could very quickly negotiate a further reduction. And that could then be implemented on the back of the New START Treaty using, again, the verification, monitoring, data exchanges, and all the other steps that are used to implement the treaty. Of course, that reduction would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. They would have to give their advice and consent. So that would be a heavy lift, but I think it would definitely be worth making the case to them. We made the case for New START. I think we can make the case for a new reduction. And by the way, I think the numbers are pretty much on the table, because back in 2013, the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed that the United States could take an up to 1/3 further reduction in operationally deployed warheads and still maintain strategic stability with possible aggressors. And so that would take our numbers down toward 1,000 below the New START number of 1,550 deployed warheads. A 1/3 reduction would be approximately 1,000 warheads. So that's a good reduction. It's a good way to get started. It will lend some momentum to the process of going after some very significant, larger objectives we have, particularly to tackle the problem of limiting warheads, non-strategic nuclear warheads, and frankly, all warheads. And so I see that as the big new goal for a new negotiation, but that will take some time. And so I think one thing we should really look at is a quick win, extend New START, and get a quick win in a further reduction pretty quickly after the extension of New START.
And when you say building that new agreement sort of on the back of New START, would that mean it would have to get completed within the extension 5-year timeframe, or could you extend the duration?
No, it's a one-time extension in New START for 5 years and no more than that. But so the life of that new treaty would be 5 years, so to say. But I think the 5 years is adequate time then to do a more ambitious treaty, to go after restrictions on warheads, to place some limits on the overall warhead numbers on the two sides. So I do think that additional 5 years buys enough time for a more ambitious reduction treaty. So the kind of quick win I'm talking about, I don't think would take very long to negotiate. Frankly, the Moscow Treaty is, I think, 2 or 3 pages long, and it only took 2 weeks, 10 days to negotiate.
Right, got it. Now, of course, Russia has said in the past that it would not agree to deeper reductions until the United States limits its strategic missile defenses, among other things. How should we deal with that?
It's very interesting to me that the advent of some of these new weapon systems that Putin has talked about, first in his famous speech in March of 2018, these weapons seem to have lent some new confidence to the Russians. Again, Putin himself has articulated the view that now with these new weapon capabilities, we don't need to worry so much about missile defenses. And so they seem to be willing to proceed forward with a further reduction of strategic offensive forces without trying to get into limiting strategic defenses. They know how difficult this issue is in the United States, the strong bipartisan support for continuing limited missile defense program. Of course, some, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, push for a larger, more comprehensive national missile defense, but there is strong bipartisan support for at least limited missile defenses. So the notion of putting constraints on those missile defenses with the Russians is not at all popular, and the Russians know that. I think they recognize that. Certainly it was a message we were always delivering during the negotiation of New START. And by the way, it might be a bit confusing when I say limited missile defenses. That means we have designed our missile defenses to be able to defend against a limited attack from a country like North Korea or possibly Iran. It doesn't mean that we are trying to defend against the very large and capable Russian strategic offensive forces with many missiles targeted at us. We're not trying to defend against that kind of capability.
Understood. And if what you're saying is correct, this would be a significant shift on the part of the Russians, where, as you say, with their new offensive systems, they'd be less concerned about United States defenses. So this could be a big deal.
I think it is a big shift because that was certainly a hard and fast condition at the end of the New START negotiations. I was told repeatedly by the Russians, they're not coming back to the table again until we agree to limit strategic defense. So it's an interesting shift. I also think it's interesting, quite honestly, because many have been concerned by this list of so-called exotic weapon systems that the Russians now have been saying that at least 2 out of the 5, maybe 3 out of the 5, they would be willing to bring under the New START treaty. They include the new Sarmat heavy ICBM. They include their so-called avant-garde HGV, hypersonic glide vehicle. And some Russian experts, I haven't really seen it on official talking points yet, but they have said that they are ready to bring the Kinjal, which is an air-launched ballistic missile, under the New START treaty. That's 2 or 3 out of the 5 so-called exotic systems. The other 2, the cruise missile, for example, that has nuclear propulsion, that had such a terrible accident in the summer of 2019 during its testing, that system is not going to be ready to deploy until New START goes out of force in any event at the end of this decade, at the end of the decade of the 2000s. If it's extended, it would be in force until 2026. And this new nuclear-propelled cruise missile will not be ready until later in the decade. The same with the other system that's on the list. So for whatever reason, the Russians seem to feel like they have capability now to withstand whatever strategic defense capability we may develop, at least in the foreseeable future. But I want to stress once again that U.S. strategic defenses are limited in nature and are focused on other threats, North Korea particularly, not on the Russians.
Right, right. And a lot has been said about hypersonic missiles. What is your sense of them? Are they a threat that has to be addressed? What's your view?
I believe that we need to take a careful look at this new technology because these are missiles that fly very quickly to their targets, and they fly on very unpredictable trajectories. With a ballistic missile that flies a ballistic flight path, it's easy to project where their point of impact is going to be. You know what their flight pattern is pretty much going to be. HGVs are taking us into territory where these missiles can maneuver a lot as they are going throughout their flight paths and as they are approaching their targets. So they will be difficult, if not impossible, to defend against. And so for that reason, that I think is one reason why the Russians have voiced some confidence now in being able to counter any U.S. defenses. But I think looking at the larger picture, they also could be pretty destabilizing because it's not only the U.S. and Russia that are developing HGVs. The Chinese have a big program, and the French have now they've actually announced that they are going to be developing an HGV. So as this technology becomes more widespread around the world, what does that mean for trying to maintain some stability between and among countries who might be aggressive toward each other?
One last question. As someone whose job it was to sustain and build on arms control agreements such as INF, New START, and Open Skies, which we haven't even gotten to, is it hard to watch the Trump administration unravel all of this crucial work?
I thought long and hard about Russia's violation of the INF Treaty. I was the Undersecretary of State during the period when we first called them on the violation. I summoned the Russian ambassador to my office in 2013 to first broach the matter with him. And the Russians, during that entire period when I was undersecretary, would not acknowledge the missile, talked about us being in violation of the treaty, and we couldn't even get into a conversation with them. The Trump administration carried that diplomacy forward. They also, I think, worked to try to get more information out there, more information to really say to the Russians, it's exactly this missile that we're concerned about. And so tell us what it is. Again, the Russians just held them at arm's length. Well, actually, they said, no, that missile, it doesn't fly to intermediate ranges. It's, it's a shorter range system. So it has been a long road from my perspective. And so with great regret, as I was working as Deputy Secretary General of NATO, I was ready and willing to work with the allies so that they could form their own assessment of whether this was a violation or not. And I'm glad to say that they had the information available from the Trump administration to make that decision. And so the entire NATO alliance agreed that this missile, the 9M729, is a violation of the INF Treaty. So it's with great regret that I saw the demise of the treaty. Now, I will say where I differ from the current administration, I would have worked a little harder once we got to the point of declaring them a material breach and notifying the withdrawal from the treaty. They said that they wanted the Russians to come back into compliance and then they'd be willing to back off the withdrawal. But I didn't frankly see much evidence in those 6 months while I was at NATO last year that they were actually working the issue. And I regretted that very much because I thought it was a lost opportunity. We could have saved the INF Treaty, I think, with some considered diplomacy.
Rose, lots to discuss here. I could keep talking with you for much longer, but unfortunately our time is up. I want to thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate your time.
It was truly my pleasure, Tom. Thanks a lot.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
Today, Zach Brown, policy associate and podcast producer, makes his debut to try to stump me with a question. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michelle. It's really good to be here. And now everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment. This week's question comes from Chris in Austria. Chris asks, what is the difference between high explosives used in a nuclear weapons program and other military and civilian purposes?
Excellent question, Chris. I tend to think of two primary differences, both in terms of the high explosives purpose and their overall effects. But first, what is a high explosive? High explosives are materials that detonate. So that means that shock waves actually pass through the material at a supersonic speed. And this is like TNT. It's normally used for mining, demolition, military purposes. So, for example, while we still don't know for sure, we think that the type of material in the Beirut blast a few weeks ago was a type of ammonium nitrate that was either used for fertilizer or designed for use in coal mines. But what does this have to do with nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons don't just use plutonium or uranium to create that destructive power. They also use high explosives, but not in the same way as conventional weapons. So in an implosion device, like the one dropped on Nagasaki, the core of the weapon is a sphere, typically made of plutonium or enriched uranium. And in order for that weapon to explode, the sphere needs to be compressed, so that the neutrons being emitted by the atoms are more likely to hit a neighboring nucleus, thereby splitting the atom. And when one splitting nucleus is likely to break apart or fission more than one additional nucleus, the material has reached what's called a supercritical state. And the energy released in this process is the destructive power of the bomb. But how does that core get compressed? That's where high explosives come in. They are layered around the core in what are called shaped charges, specific shapes that detonate with a specific timing, so that those shock waves are focused inwards, compressing the core and starting the fissioning. And typically that involves materials like triamino trinitrobenzene, or TATB, not to be confused with the Netflix show, along with other high explosives that are selected for their explosive power, their ability to be molded, and hopefully insensitivity. You really only want them to go off when they're subjected to really specific conditions, not, other accidental pressures or, impulses. So, but in a conventional weapon, on the other hand, high explosives are the source of the destructive energy. They're not the initial trigger like they are in nuclear weapons. So this leads us to the other main difference, which is the scale of destruction. The energy in nuclear weapons blasts are measured in kilotons. A kiloton is the amount of energy released in 1,000 tons of TNT, or 2 million pounds. Let that sink in, 2 million pounds of TNT. That scale is almost unthinkably larger and is one of the reasons that weapons of mass destruction have been named as such. They are weapons of genocide, of extinction, as Jonathan Schell put it. But I don't say this to minimize the effects of conventional weapons fueled by high explosives. We all saw the video of the Beirut explosion, and as of right now, 178 people have been reported killed and over 30 are missing. It was devastating. And I highly suggest listeners read up on the Halifax explosion of 1917. Conventional bombs are a common tool of warfare and are responsible for millions of human injuries and deaths. So, getting back to then that original question, when we think of the differences, it really does come down to those two elements, to purpose and to scale. And in this case, in a nuclear weapon, there are fewer high explosives that are used to start a much larger explosion and effect.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Chris. And remember, if you would like to get your question answered on air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod on Twitter, or send us an email at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.